Well, hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all on this very chilly winter's day for this very exciting online conversation as part of our online series for 2022. My name is Barbara Baikie, and I'm a founding member of the Congress and your host for today. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we're meeting today, land that was never ceded, and in Canberra, that's the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. And we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So wherever you are around the country, please feel free to enter your name and the First Nations country on where you are tonight. Just pop it in the chat. At the WCC, we integrate the arts into all our work, as the arts has the capacity to engage us, move us, and bring us into that heart space. So today I'm going to start with a poem by American poet Sylvia Stilts, and it's called Worn. The sands of time have rendered fear. Blue skies on high are no longer clear. Stars were bright whence they came, now dimmed, obscured, pollution's haze. Crystal clear our waters gleamed, fish abundant, rivers streamed, ocean floors sandy white, now littered, brown, pollution's plight. Trees towered high above, trunks bearing professed love, birds chirping from sights unseen, gone, paper joined pollution's team. One can't blame pollution alone. As they say, you reap what you have sown. So let us plant a better seed, tear out old roots, cultivate and weed. Protect what has been given for free, our waters, skies, wildlife and trees. For once they're gone, don't you say, consider yourself warned on that fatal day. So it's a slightly grim sort of context, but also that sense of hope that we can plant a seed, and that's what we're going to do today. But I want to also add another little quote to that, and that is by Margaret Reed, and many of you will know it, I'm sure. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So the Women's Climate Congress was founded with the objective of bringing together polarised voices in our public discourse to resolve the current disputes and agree on national priorities and actions to address climate risks. And today we have our very own Women's Climate Congress founder, Dr. Janet Salisbury, and welcome former New South Wales Liberal Party leader Kerry Chikorovsky and climate emergency strategist Cheryl Durant to explore how women can lead multi-party collaborative action to transcend the political climate wars, to create a national plan for action on climate change and change before it's too late. We have seen from the recent election that there is a desire for this in the electorate, so our discussion today is very timely. But before we get there, just some housekeeping. In a minute, I will introduce Janet and she'll introduce our two speakers. And after that, we will invite some Q&A from you. So please put any questions in the chat as we go. I will also be the guardian of the process and keep an eye on the time, review your questions in the chat and try and put as many as I can to the panel. This event is being recorded and we will circulate a copy of those to participating. We will record on speaker view, so it's unlikely that you'll be seen, but if you want to just make sure, just turn your video off. So now it's my great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Janet Salisbury. Janet.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for that opening and that poem, sort of reminding us that we've seen the warning signs coming for quite a long time now, and it is really time to be taking action. I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm on Ngunnawal and the Ngambri land here in Canberra, and thank you to all of those of you putting your place of the land that you're coming from into the chat. It's great to see that, and so many people coming from different places as well. And do leave your video on if you're happy to have it on, because it's nice to sort of get a sense of connection with everyone. That's a good thing about a Zoom meeting as opposed to a webinar. So yes, in January 2020, when the Black Summer bushfires were raging and choking smoke was all around, it did seem as though Earth's fury had actually been unleashed on us. But even in the face of that terrible disaster, and after more than a decade of bitter debate, our government was divided, seemingly unable to move the political dial enough to create a nationally agreed plan to address climate risks. The Women's Climate Congress was born out of this grief and frustration. And we have an underlying conviction that if enough women came together in solidarity, we could promote a new collaborative discourse and lead a new way forward. But we do understand that government is a really complicated business, with lots of different voices to balance inside the House, not to mention pressures from advisors, business lobbyists and activists, and it is very hard. And I certainly don't profess to know the answers myself. And we at the Climate Congress don't know the answers ourselves, but we are actually sure that the climate scientists know what they're talking about. And we need to work very hard together to solve the problem. So our approach has been to advocate for a mediated roundtable process to bring diverse stakeholders together to develop a non-partisan national plan for action on climate change. So we're very excited to have two guests from very different parts of the political and public policy spectrums here with us today, both of whom have advocated for a national conversation on climate action and risk assessment. And we're going to talk together about how we can promote such a non-partisan process to create a national plan for action that we so much want, that we can all get behind. So I'm just going to introduce our two guests. Kerry Chikorovsky is the former New South Wales Liberal leader and was the first woman to lead a major political party in New South Wales. Now she's masquerading behind the name of Lisa Chikorovsky here today because she's
technically incompetent and needed her daughter to actually set this up.
But I'm sure you recognise her anyway. So her current day job is as director of Chikorovsky and Associates, a government relations, community engagement and stakeholder relations consultancy, which she founded in 2003. And she told us the other day that she's very busy with a lot of stakeholder engagement at the moment. She holds a number of non-executive board roles, including with the New South Wales Waratahs Rugby Union and a number of other organisations. And she's also the chair of the New South Wales Women's Rugby Union. I don't know whether this means that you play rugby, Kerry?
No, I'm far too old, but girls didn't play rugby when I was in my teens. Some did in the country, but certainly not in the city.
All right. And she's an ambassador for the Australian Indigenous Education Foundation, and she mentors other professional women's sports people on and off the field. She's frequently on national television and radio, and including on my favourite ABC current affairs show, The Drum. So welcome, Kerry. And Cheryl Durrant has over 30 years experience in the national security sector, including as a specialist army intelligence and defence capability and preparedness roles. She's had a number of roles in this area. She led the department's Global Change and Energy Sustainability Initiative and established the position of the Australian Defence Forces Climate and Security Advisor. I think that was in 2016. She's championed a lot of international cross-government academic and business collaborations, focusing on a better understanding and preparedness for existential risks and the connections between climate change and other security risks. She's a member of the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group. She also has international connections with the Climate and Security Working Group Asia Pacific and is a fellow of the Institute of Integrated Economic Research in Australia. And finally, she's also a councillor with the Climate Council. So welcome, Cheryl.
Thanks, Janet.
So I'm going to start with a segment talking about this idea of having a national plan, a national conversation towards a national plan. And I'm going to start with a question for Kerry, because after the devastating floods in New South Wales earlier this year, and Queensland as well, earlier this year, I heard you speaking, Kerry, on The Drum, because I said that was one of my favourite current affairs programmes. And you were speaking about the need for the parties in federal parliament to come together to develop a national plan for action on climate change. And you said you've been advocating for this since the 2019 to 20 bushfire summer. So I'd just like you to talk to us now about how you were thinking this non-partisan approach might work, and how we can work with the new government now to ensure that the more collaborative approach that they have indicated that they want to bring has multi-party support.
Well, I think the pandemic provided us with a model which shows that you can actually get governments at all levels of all shapes and sizes and all different political persuasions to work together. The National Cabinet, I thought, worked very well during the pandemic because it was seen to be a national crisis. Now, I appreciate that the difficulty with climate policy at a federal level has been, it's been the difference between the coalition and the opposition, and coalition and the Labor Party trying to come together. But I think that model of a collaborative approach between, you know, the key players is what the federal government now, and I would hope the coalition opposition could see could work to get a solution. The reality is that they're never going to agree on everything. I mean, that's just, you know, the nature of politics. But I think, you know, I'm sitting in Sydney at the moment. I'm very lucky. I'm sitting in Sydney and I live in a lovely apartment, which is nice and warm. But a lot of people out there today, particularly in New South Wales, are feeling the cold. They're feeling it terribly. They're also reading the headlines and listening to the news, which is saying that they could be facing blackouts in the next 24 to 48 hours, which in this absolutely bitter cold weather is going to be, you know, heartbreaking for them all. So I think that there is an imperative now on all sides of politics and at all levels of politics to try and work through some solutions. And we've seen that this week as well, with some energy ministers coming together, and again, of various political persuasions, trying to find a solution to the energy crisis. So, you know, I've said, and you saw me on the drum, I said I'm accused of being Pollyannish about this because I do genuinely believe that there is goodwill in all parts of the parliament to do something about it. Now, clearly, there is a greater opportunity in some ways because of the composition of the new federal parliament. With the new federal parliament having so many Teals and Greens, as well as the Labor Party there, there is certainly going to be a much louder voice within the parliament and a much more cohesive voice, if you like, in the majority of the parliament about the need for change. The challenge will be for the Liberal Party and the National Party to come on board with that. But you've already seen some of that, even with David Littleproud, who was saying he's taking a much gentler approach than I think that than his predecessor, the former leader of the National Party, did. So I'm actually feeling pretty buoyant about it. You know, as I say, out of every crisis comes an opportunity. And the crisis we're seeing at the moment, particularly in the energy markets, is an opportunity for both sides of the parliament to work out what they can do to move us forward on climate policy.
All right, thanks. I might just have a little follow-up question there before I go to Cheryl, in that I just wonder what you think a national sort of conversation like this would, or a multi-party conversation would actually look like. I mean, Jim Chalmers before the election had picked up an idea that I think Jenny Macklin had written about a couple of years ago, which was for a climate accord, a process a little bit like, I suppose, the wages accord. Is that the sort of thing that you would be thinking about? Or
I mean, I think that's one way of approaching it. We did see that when we had the wages accord, we had, you know, employers and employees and everyone coming together. That worked for the benefit of the nation. I think the Labor Party believe that they've got a mandate. My concern would be that if they decided that mandate was going to push the coalition into a corner where they couldn't support them, I would hate to think that, because I genuinely believe we need to have at least majority agreement on what we need to go forward, because you can't have something happen in the next 3 years and then, you know, if there's a change of government in the next 3 or 6 years after that, you can't revert. So we need to have, and particularly on something as significant as this. I also have a similar view, by the way, about taxation reform. I think we should have taxation reform as a bipartisan policy as well, but that seems to be getting less support, let me tell you.
Right. Interesting. Well, thank you. So I'll just turn to Cheryl now, and then we can come back and pick up some other points. Cheryl, I first noticed your work a year or so ago in relation to the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group. And in an open letter to government, this group, your group, wrote, As ex-service members and experienced security practitioners who have witnessed up close the devastation of war and crisis, we consider that climate change now represents the greatest threat to the future and security of Australians. The first duty of government is the safety and protection of the people, but Australia has failed when it comes to climate change threats. Australia currently has no credible climate policy, leaving our nation unprepared for increasingly harsh impacts. Climate must be made an immediate security priority at the top of the national agenda, with commitment for mobilisation and emergency action from all sides. So the Australian security leaders have called for a whole of nation climate and security risk assessment. Can you just talk us through that a little bit, and how a security risk assessment relates to the whole of nation approach that we've just been also talking about in relation to our transitioning away from fossil fuels?
Yeah, so thanks, Janet. And I'm joining everyone today from Palawaland in northwest Tasmania, and I pay my respects to their leaders, past, present and emerging. And I think it's important to recognise that, because unless we're truly having a whole of nation conversation about risk, we're going to be missing key chunks of risk, because risk is ultimately about what we value. If we value something, then it's a real sort of concerning risk, but things we don't value, we can actually lose. And the key thing we as security professionals saw with climate change is we haven't really got our heads around the pervasiveness of climate change as a risk, because it's not just a problem about the environment and energy, for example. It's a problem about social policy, health, security, agricultural policy, IT policy, how much cyber storage we need to have. All of these things are affected by climate change, and all of these things are having an impact on climate change. And so what's talked around in the international security community now is risk cascades, where something that starts with an extreme weather event, failure of crops, cascades then into impacts on human livelihoods, ability to work and feed ourselves. And if governments are weak and societies are disunited and divided, then this cascades further into crime. It starts crossing borders in migration, and it may eventually lead to conflict. And the World Economic Forum now is very concerned in its risk report 2022. It highlighted that because the world has lost a decade, if you like, on climate action, or 2 decades or 3 decades for some, that we now have a very small Goldilocks zone, or a very small good path out of climate change. And if we don't act fast enough, we start having the worse and worse weather effects, the worse and worse environmental effects. But if we act too fast and impacts too much on people's livelihoods, we get social disruption and social disorder. So there's now this very small zone to get right. So we'll be very quick, but at the same time, we need to bring everyone along with us. And that's why the very first step of bringing people along with us is actually to have a frank and fearless conversation about risk. And it needs to be inclusive of everyone, because what I value may be different to what someone else values. And unless we're teasing out those values which underpin our risk judgments, we're going to have someone imposing a risk decision on us. And we don't think that's a good point to start a conversation, because that's partly why we're in the bind we are now with a lack of bipartisan action. We have very different values, different sides of politics and different walks of life. And the risk process is a way that those can be surfaced by identifying what we care about.
Yeah. So in relation to those things that you're talking about, then this very small window of opportunity that we have, and then thinking about how we've also got this window of opportunity that we're just talking about with Kerry, of a new government and people talking about a more collaborative approach. That even if Australia, is that going to be enough? Even if Australia gets its act together to transition or to make changes and to get our national planning, is that, what's happening at the globe? Is that going to be enough for the global?
Well, this is where the Americans, for a number of years, or since the change of their government, have been asking us to show more ambition and more leadership. And Australia can be a leader. It was a leader internationally. It has been a leader internationally. And it's uniquely placed to be a leader because it has a wealth of renewable resources and you hear Ross Garnaut and others talk about renewable energy superpower. But we're also an agricultural superpower as well. And so these are the two major change sectors. And if Australia takes its resources, its research, all of which is world leading, puts it together with a little bit of ambition and willpower, and there's some great Australian companies and good news stories in this space. But then we can start bringing that out to the region in the first instance and catalysing change. And it's one of these things, if we get a roll on, then the other countries have no advantage by not acting. If we're dragging the chain, then we sort of give permissiveness to other countries to drag the chain. So it's really important to be a leader in this space at this time.
Yeah, thanks. So in a minute, I want to come back to the point that you were making there about us all having different values. But just for the moment, I'm going to turn a little bit to the second theme I want to bring into this conversation, which is the significance of women's voices, or is this something that we can really build on, and both inside the Parliament now and outside. So Kerry, I just want to ask you about this in relation to the election. Clearly showed a very large grassroots call for action on climate and also for more women's representation in Parliament. And Australia is one of the only countries not to have a women's caucus, I'll call it that for want of a better word for the moment, for women to come together on issues of common concern. And climate emergencies are known to have the worst impacts on women and children, so it clearly is an issue of concern for women. Is this a good time for establishment of a women's group to lead policy development around climate change and mitigation, and also the risk, looking at some of the risks that Cheryl's talking about?
Well, look, again, because I look at the world through rose-coloured glasses, I'd like to think that that was possible. My personal experience of trying to do that, though, goes back to when I was a member of Parliament in the New South Wales Parliament. We had one lunch, cross-party lunch, where we came together to talk about issues which we thought were of concern to all of us as women within the Parliament. And there were even less women in the Parliament then than there were in the New South Wales Parliament than there are in the federal Parliament now. And the problem with that lunch was it was never repeated, because we had some pretty hardcore left people on this side of the table and some pretty hardcore right people on this side of the table. And they almost got into, well, they got into a Barney, fortunately not a physical Barney, but they got into a Barney, and they walked out of the room saying, I'm never sitting down with that person ever again. Now, hopefully, we've all matured. And I suspect one of the reasons that was so difficult was that there were so few women in the Parliament. Now we've got, in the federal Parliament, there's going to be a lot more women there. The federal Labor caucus will have more women in it than the coalition caucus, if you look at the numbers. But you've also got a significant number of independents, so people sitting on the crossbench. And the issues that the crossbench in particular campaigned on are issues which the Labor Party believe in, have campaigned on. They're issues that the Greens have obviously campaigned on. And if you actually look at the people within the Liberal Party who have strong feelings on this, apart from the ones who are no longer there because the Teals took them out, there are a number of people who have very strong feelings about the need for action within the Liberal caucus as well. And some of those people are women in reasonably high positions within the party. So I'm more than happy to suggest to some of my colleagues within the Parliament whether they would like to consider such an idea. But that, you go into those things with the very clear view, though, that it's a position that everyone gets heard and everyone is heard equally. It doesn't matter who's got the numbers, everyone has to have a voice. I'm not sure, to be honest. I'm absolutely not sure whether that would be taken up by either side of the Parliament. The Labor Party might decide that they don't need to be caucusing with women on the other side. The Liberal Party might feel that they haven't got the numbers to actually compete with the Labor number of Labor women in caucus. So I don't know. I don't know the logistics around it. But I said to you previously that I'm happy to float the idea and to see what sort of reaction it gets. Because you're right. I mean, we all know that things like the whole climate change debate is impacting severely on women, and not just women in Australia, but women across the world. And everybody I know who's in that Parliament, male or female, has gone into it with a social conscience, with a desire to actually produce the best social outcomes they possibly can for their community, whether that's their local community, their state community, their national community, or the international community. So there may be an opportunity, but I can't guarantee it.
Do you think that the happenings of last March and the, bullying of women and all of that came out at the time, workplace safety, has sort of changed the way in which women are working together in the Parliament now?
Look, I'm not that close to it to see whether those discussions have gone across party lines. There was certainly cross-party support for change. There was no doubt about that. And for the inquiries that were being conducted within the Parliament and by people like Liz Broderick, those were supported by cross-party support. But to be fair, they were supported by the men and the women in the parties. It wasn't just a women's thing that was leading that. Yeah. And to be frank, it needed to be supported by the blokes, because a lot of the behaviour that we were hearing about was being perpetrated by men. So we had to actually have them buy into the process to try and find a resolution. Has that led to a greater level of cooperation across parties for the women? I don't know the answer to that. But as I said, I'm more than happy to explore it, to see whether there is an opportunity to encourage that cross-party support for issues. And it's not just, there is, for example, I sit in the domestic violence space. I sit on the board for of Our Watch, and there's always been cross-party support for any initiatives in relation to domestic violence. What we need to do is to translate that cross-party support, perhaps led by women, into an area of policy which has been, as we all know, completely controversial for the last 20 years. So if we could get some leadership from the women, and it's not just the women in the ministerial positions, it's the women who sit on the backbench, that would be a really, really, really good place to engender that, my Pollyanna view of the world, and that is to get everybody on the same page.
Yeah. Apparently, Australia is only one of, it may be the only OECD country not to have a women's caucus, or there's only very few that don't anyway. So it's definitely something that seems to be a little bit overdue here. So just coming back to Cheryl, picking up a little bit on the grassroots call for action, but just still keeping this women thing in mind as well. And thinking about citizen representation, you've also been doing some work with the United Nations, a people's mechanism for implementing the UN Charter for Human Rights. And I think that sits along, you might have to explain this a little bit, but I think that sits along existing other mechanisms for implementing the human rights, like the treaty and so on. And this people's mechanism is based on listening, connecting, and truth-telling to create a more heartfelt sense of who the plans are being designed for when you're planning, who you're designing for. So can you just talk us through that a little bit and tie in maybe with our thoughts about
so thanks. And this comes out of the work of a very powerful thinker, Dr. Dorothea Christiana, who's the UN Scotland rep. And she did her thesis on how the UN was failing civil society. It had become too bureaucratic, too hierarchical, too much about its own power. These are similar themes we were finding in government and other institutions as well. These were two masculine institutions. They were very planning, thinking, brainy, and they were trying to do their best to remove harm. And as we see, the in UN it was undoing the badness of the Great War that the powers had faced, and it was trying to take harm out of the world. And so it had been set up in a certain way and operated in a certain way. But the feel from civil society groups who were involved in UN mechanisms was their voices weren't getting heard. They weren't getting to the top. They weren't powerful. They didn't have equality with national representatives and full-term bureaucrats. And so while it's a United People's Charter, it's a very feminine approach, because the group that's sort of looking at how this might evolve into a practical mechanism basically didn't want to just have women or disadvantaged peoples or silenced voices operating in this very right brain planny type of way. want to say, well, let's look at what is missing in the world for the last 2,000 years, and it's feminine and female type approaches, which is from the heart rather than the head. So much about listening as it is about doing. It's about connecting. And the little story we told is you might have a child who's cut their finger, and the planning mind says, put a Band-Aid on it. But the connecting, witnessing, feeling mind says, give the child a hug. And so both those responses are needed. So the trick is to try and shift this really dominant paradigm of engineering, planning, rational, reductionist logic, and actually not just have women in that process, but creating a new process that is creative, caring, from the heart. It's about connecting as much as it is about planning, because if you have a connection to someone who is a refugee or someone who is suffering, it's very hard not to respond to that person. But if you're just intellectually going, there are 3,000 refugees here and 2 million there, they're just numbers and they don't really necessarily compel a response, but it's actually knowing these as humans and people we care about and know about that actually compels the response. The response arises naturally rather than having to be forced and imposed on someone. So it's a long process, but given your earlier comment, Janet, that the international community needs to move as well, it's one of the things we need to have on our radar generally is how can international mechanisms be strengthened. And as I say, having a women's caucus and a women's voice in Australia is a first thing, but connecting to women and other movements globally, I think, is also important.
Yeah, it's really interesting because even though we have a feeling that women's, or pretty sure that women's leadership is very important. And when we formed the Women's Climate Congress, we thought this was a time for women to really speak out and to lead. And of course, our equity, and we have been totally underrepresented and still are. So there's work to do there. But people then come and say, well, why are you a Women's Climate Congress? Why don't you, that's not very inclusive. Why don't you include the men? And so we constantly have to go back and sort of rethink why we think it's important to hold this space for women in order for women to come in and experience some of these other ways of thinking and being, and how that can be translated into a policy type of environment. Because I've got a feeling, and maybe Kerry, you can comment on this, that women have been so busily fitting into this masculinized environment that we don't really have much chance to think about what we would really want or what we would really prioritize if we were able to act more on our own terms. Do you have?
Well, look, I don't know that I'd agree with that, because I think that the women I've known in Parliament, both personally with the ones I've worked with and the ones I've known through my associations with parliaments around the country, they're rarely intimidated by the parliament. The process of getting yourself elected into parliament is trying enough in itself that they don't. I don't know too many who sit in a party room who sit back quietly and don't have a say. None of the women I worked with would have regarded themselves as I was once called by a certain Labor minister, a delicate little flower. None of them would be delicate little flowers. So I don't know that the actual process or the parliament itself is intimidating for women. I think what has been difficult for women is that we've not had them in enough positions of authority and leadership. And when they have gotten into those positions, and I'm the first to say that Julia Gillard was badly treated. And I've said that to her personally, and I've said it publicly before. But I think that's not so much just about the parliament. I think we have a media which I think treats women differently, not just Julia, they treat women differently, and they have for some considerable time. It annoys the crap out of me that, women still get commented on the clothes they're wearing. Who cares, for God's sake, who cares? But that still happens, and I find that annoying. But I also think that the other thing which I think is making it difficult for women in public life, and it's not just in Parliament, but in public life, is social media. I think that women on social media are treated disproportionately unfairly. I absolutely acknowledge that a lot of the men on, particularly the politicians, have been trolled mercilessly on social media. But what happens with women, and, I put up my hand up here, I've been subject to it a fair bit myself. It's nasty and it's personal. And, my favorite story is that I was doing a radio interview with a former Labor politician who shall remain nameless. And we were sitting in the waiting room and we were talking about social media. And I was saying that, I had just been on the drum or somewhere, and I had this post on Twitter which said, you're stupid, you're boring, and you're bloody ugly. And she said, oh, he says the same thing about me. So, and we were both on different sides of the Parliament. So I do think all of that is really makes it more difficult for women. You have to be tougher than a bloke to be in Parliament and in public life. But I do think, I'm not convinced that the Parliament itself or the people within it, the men within it, treat women as badly as some of the media would like to make out.
Yeah, I suppose I wasn't entirely thinking that women were not able to stand up for themselves. It's more that the policy environment is one that's been handed down for quite a few hundred years now with a male lens, and so we maybe need to come together to really think about a different way of looking at policy, or what our priorities will be. And that was to be the point of the Women's Caucus, to allow women that space to.
Yeah. But I think to be honest, if you're talking about policy development within political parties, there are enough women there on both sides now, and in all parties, that they do put a woman's view to it. They do have a look at it and say, well, how is this going to impact? Is this policy going to impact us as women more adversely, or us as, for our families more adversely? So I think there is much more consciousness about that now than there was, 20 years ago when I was in Parliament. So I don't think it's as desperate as you'd like to be, as you kind of suggesting. But is there room for improvement? No doubt, absolutely no doubt. And I think what you're trying to do through this forum is to get together a policy which perhaps has a different lens to that which has been developed within the political parties, which my advice to you would be you present to both parties and ask them to actually think about how what they've been talking about is impacted by what you're talking about.
Yeah, sure. Cheryl, do you want?
For me, Jan, it's more an additive process. It's not replicating the same structures we have. What really encouraged me from the last election in Australia was the power behind the voices of groups. It's democracy in action. And I was privileged enough to present to a number on Zoom and some face-to-face. And you see that the politicians who did well, most but not all women, largely the Teal Rising was a very participatory democratic process, and it wasn't just women, but it was different voices, but authentic voices coming in rather than people in power of a certain demographic and with a certain background and looking a certain way. And so for me, you can have a women's caucus and it adds something unique to itself. The worst thing it can do is just become a clone of another process, a lobby group or an advocate group. It has to be a thing of itself, speaking authentically with women's voices in a woman's way. That won't be the only voice. There may be an Indigenous group, there may be a disadvantaged group, there could be minors, and the whole process of democracy these days, we have the technology. We can actually have a much more participatory process in our democracies. We're on one today. We're on it with Zoom, and there is massive online courses, massive online scenarios, citizens' juries, a whole lot of novel policy mechanisms. And so for me, it's just like, it's not one or t'other. It's just a constant additive process. So let's add to it rather than sort of try and be subsumed by an existing political process, which, as you say, Janet, I find as a woman who's had to succeed in the defence world, you do get sucked into acting in a certain way to win the game in that type of world. And I think that's the false path. Don't become another masculine engineering process, become a truly woman's process.
Okay, thanks. So I might just see if Barbara's got any questions that she'd like to add, and also things what's coming up from the chat a little bit.
Okay, there is some great questions, and first of all, I'm just going to say there was a bit of a comment to you, Kerry, that said it's a relief to find another Pollyanna, because Pollyanna can actually take some form. So that was from Rob O'Connor. So there are some great questions. So I'm going to try and get through them, because as I said, there's great questions. Kirsten Anker asked, what confidence, and I'll address this to both of you and then some of you individually, but to both of you, what confidence do you have that there will be bipartisan determination to tackle climate change?
Well, I think that, as I said, you've heard from, David Littleproud, who's the new leader of the National Party, that they're working towards, addressing the issue. I mean, look, previous National Party leaders have said, not all of them, but previous ones have not wanted to talk about this. If you talk to anybody in the political world, they always say to me, oh, well, the Liberal Party will never get anything done because the National Party are being troglodytes about this. Well, you're seeing significant change after the election, and understand that the National Party held all their seats. So they're a party which in many ways didn't really need to have a change of heart in relation to climate change. But I think we're already seeing some signs in relation to that. I certainly think that within the Liberal Party, they'll be taking a good hard look at what they took to the election. They'll be taking a good hard look at the policies that they've previously advocated. And they will be looking to see what the Labor Party and the Teals and the Greens come up with. I don't think they're going to agree 100% on everything that's put up to them. I'm not that naive, but I do think that there's a much greater willingness to work towards a solution. And as I said, they're looking at what's happening in Australia today, and they will not be able to ignore climate change.
Thank you, Cheryl.
You're on mute.
You're on mute still.
I'll pass on that one.
Okay. So this is from Dean Newton. What strategy do you think we need to have to keep the pressure on the grassroots power on climate change? And particularly looking forward to the New South Wales election, and given that there's no Morrison factor. So what strategy, Cheryl, do you think we could have to keep that pressure on as a grassroots pressure?
So I think certainly the conversations I'm having with the advocacy groups I'm involved with is, we've celebrate 2/3 of the country had voted for clear action on climate change, among other things. But that's just the very first step. And so it's really, for me, the real power is coming bottom up from community. And I think that's changing how politicians are responding, or the challenges for politicians to change. So I think it's just keep being engaging with activities such as this, with voices of groups, talking to your local member, turning up at your local council. Unless we're making democracy happen, it's something that's happening to us. And so I think that is the key thing, is just to keep those grassroots alternate voices, community voices, just keep coming in and pushing back against some of the really quite negative post-election response we've seen, unfortunately, in the media. So the antidote to that is community, not better media, I'm afraid, in the short term.
Yeah. Thank you. To Kerry, this is from Zol Diishtar, and also to Cheryl, if you want to contribute, but particularly for you, Kerry. You use the word buoyant, suggesting that you feel that we will float above the turbulence of climate change. Can you please unpack that further as to why and how you arrived at this promise of buoyancy? And what do you think it'll take us, a glove move, to move from that floating above to actually coming down to actually dry land and a scenario where the climate crisis puzzle is solved?
Well, I'm not sure that I used it in that context, but let me just say that what I am suggesting is that there is significant movement at all levels of government now. For example, in New South Wales, you've seen Matt Keane as the former Environment Minister and now as Treasurer. They set targets before the federal government did. They have committed to ensuring that there are renewable energy zones. They're working very hard to get New South Wales ready for and to be part of the energy future, which includes renewables. So, and a lot, the state governments around the country, most of the state governments around the country are doing the same. South Australia, of course, has been a leader in this. So I think that my buoyancy, if I use that word, and I'm sorry if I didn't quite sure which context I use it, but if I use that word, it was more about the fact that I think that the mood for change, the opportunity for change, and the decisiveness about change is coming from all across the country. And, to Cheryl's point, it's coming from community as much as it is from government. And I think it's because of that, it's the interaction of all those things which will make it, I think, a much easier job for governments of all persuasions at all levels to actually do something about this. I think there is just genuinely goodwill about it all, which is why I would like to see something, as I said, akin to a national cabinet, which included the opposition, to get to a defined position for the country. Because the states, as I said, they're doing it anyway. They're happy to take some leadership with the feds, I would think. Maybe they should all sit down in a room and thrash out some great ideas.
Thank you. Cheryl, did you want to add anything? Or will I go on to the next question?
Just go on to the next one.
Okay. This is an interesting one about media, and that Murdoch media still controls a large part of the public messaging, and particularly on climate change. And how do we as women collectively address the issue of ongoing media capture by vested interests driving climate change or denial or delay? And again, what would a non-partisan approach look like to this? That might be for you too, Kerry.
Well, I think, the influence of the media, the Murdoch media in particular, has been probably overemphasised, because if you read, the Daily Telegraph, you read the Australian, they were clearly campaigning against all the Teals. They campaigned against the Labor Party. The editorial in the Australian on the day of the election was to vote for the coalition. So how many people paid attention to them is, I think, probably a moot point. I do actually think social media drives things much more effectively. And I think that the Labor Party, to their credit, and the Teals, to their credit, to Cheryl's point earlier, they managed their social media so much better than the coalition, and they drove an agenda through that social media. So I'm not sure that you could ever have the media as being non-partisan. They will always take a point of view, but using new media, which is much more cost effective, let me tell you, much more cost effective, and reaches the audience which obviously turned out to vote at the last federal election, is, I think, the way of the future. I just exclude, my antipathy towards Twitter is probably coming through. I loathe and detest Twitter, but having said that, I'm still on it. But that's because, I do think it needs to be regulated in a way, and that's a discussion for another day. But I do think that I don't think you should be too bent out of shape about the influence of the Murdoch media anymore. I think people take less and less of their commentary and less of their advice from traditional media, and much more so from, as I said, social media and online. They're more than happy to investigate for themselves and find out the truths of things. So fake news, I don't think, is as big an issue as people would like to think it is.
Thanks, Kerry.
I'd just like to add that as more processes become engaging, like social media, you can engage with it and respond to it. Old media is just very passive.
Yeah.
But it's very clever because it has got a lot of psychology and some smart big data analytics behind it. But what is, I think, really coming in now is processes where you can engage with the advocacy or engage with the politicians and have your say. So things like Vote Compass and others. And there's no reason with the technologies we have today where people can't actually, why not have a policy game? And one of the things we looked at in one of the groups I was at was, why not have a massive climate policy game in Australia? So instead of talking about it, we actually, we've got massive online games played globally where, people are spending hours of their time on Warhammer or you know, Game of Thrones game. And why can't we have games? And they're serious games. So this is a policy tool that the UK Design Lab have pulled up. And so there's much more interesting tools now that you can use to engage with exploring the future and engage with getting information and conversations out. And so I think we can't choose the old media, but we can choose the new media. And I think there's a lot more avenues for people to explore than just social media and old media.
Thanks very much, Cheryl. And now a question for you is Bobby Allen would like to hear a bit more about your thinking about climate as a security threat.
Yes, and it's when I say security, one of the things the Security Leaders Group is keen to point out that viewing everything through a national security lens is actually often very counterproductive, because national security thinking is designed to have enemies. It's like a hammer and a nail. They have to have an enemy in it. But there are other security disciplines and emerging schools of thought that are far more useful. And the one I've put a link up to earlier, or Nettie has kindly for me, is the security threats that bind us, which is looking at ecological security. And so it's bringing the security thinking out, not just between security between peoples or nations, but security has to also include the relationship between people and the environment, globally as well as locally, but also between generations now and generations in the future. And so we're trying to get that broader security lens that's not just looking at national security and say who's winning the critical minerals war. That would be very counterproductive. It's going, okay, how are we going to restore and regenerate and get our planet into balance, and how are we going to do so in a way that doesn't prompt conflict? And it's a real difficult one, because as we see now with Russia and the Ukraine, the security language that was coming from the US and from NATO, the Secretary General of the UN, UK, pretty much globally last year was climate change is it. And now we've been dragged back into this horrible cycle of us and them, which is counterproductive if we need to get on top of climate change. So just got to keep dragging that security lens back to actually, if we don't get on top of climate, it's an existential threat to humanity, probably through destroying our agricultural systems. And that would we see now with a little bit of food shock, how shocking that is. And just imagine it on much, much larger scales. And that would just sort of be catastrophic if you have countries as big as India and Indonesia not being able to feed themselves. Just imagine there's almost 2 billion people in those two countries alone. They have huge climate risks. India has undergone a horrible heat wave and drought. All across Africa, if we think, we've got problems with 4 refugees, a country that I do some work with a small team of regenerative agriculture in Uganda, have 2 million refugees in Uganda. They're climate refugees. They're moving out of the Sahel regions where crops are drying up and people can't live and work anymore. And so unless we're thinking security of the planet, where collaboration is self-interest, we're going to go down, I think, a horrible pathway to war and conflict.
Yeah, I might just, if I can just come in there, because I mean, one of the things in the Women's Climate Congress that we talk about is, to restore nurture of life and care for the planet to the centre of policy discussions. And it always seems to me that as soon as there's any discussion, in the media or on current affairs programs or in the news about climate change, it goes straight to the energy prices or the technology, and it goes straight to technological sort of issues around reducing emissions. And this conversation, the way you've just expressed it there, which is very doesn't come to the fore, and when the student strikers come out, they are talking about their future, but in the policy arena, they're reluctant to talk about that. How can we get that conversation a bit more into the forefront of the policy discussion? Kerry, do you have a thought on that?
Well, I think it's because everyone is trying to find solutions, and they what you've just talked about is an attitude rather than a solution. And I think that's the issue, is that you need to translate the attitude into a solution. Because, you know, back to the comments earlier about people are thinking, how can we fix it?
Yeah.
Or the conversation is always about how can we fix it? And what you're suggesting doesn't seem to factor into the how. It's the why we need to do it, but everyone's much more focused on the how. So I'm not sure how you get that into the conversation.
Can I just quickly take a different, because the great systems thinker Donella Meadows says the most powerful thing for change is changing the attitude or the paradigm.
Yep.
So if you change the paradigm, the how flows along, where if you focus too much on the how, you continue to sort of reinforce the wrong path. And climate change ultimately is a problem not actually about the environment, it's actually a problem of unsustainable consumption. And so many of our solutions are just ramping up consumption, which is not going to help. Well, it may help a bit, but it's not going to ultimately solve it. And so in many ways, changing the attitudes, you get this in human dynamics. You know, one day we're all going left, the next day we're all going right, because suddenly some new zeitgeist or new thinking has emerged. So I think don't focus too much on the numbers and the fixes, but don't stop focusing on them. You need to. It's not again one or t'other. It's again everything in. We're now too close to disaster to ignore pathways, and who knows where that spark of genius comes from. So too much time arguing about do it this way or do it that way, and not enough time sort of just going with the flow of the solutions that are offered. I mean, I spent hours in groups sort of debating whether the target should be 75 or 70%. It's like, no, just get moving, go to action.
But the problem with that approach is that ignores the reality of political life. And the reality of political life is that people expect governments to provide solutions. And that's the issue for them, that they don't. And so governments, when they're looking at a problem of this magnitude, yes, I appreciate the attitude issue is important, but, you know, they'll say we've got 3 years in which to find some results and we need to find the solutions. And if we put up something which is not going to produce, you know, which doesn't show, and it doesn't have to be an immediate result, but it has to be seen to be a step along a path. And if those steps aren't there, then governments will say, we're going to be torn apart by the media, we'll be torn apart by the community. We need to have some level of commitment to a result.
Yeah, I'd take the opposite view. I think the result is a very planning thing. But then governments before in the past have had different approaches. So we're talking of the environment of government that we have now that perhaps we need to discard, because it is that masculine male planning outcomes, results oriented structure. Not all governments have been like that, and not all future governments need be. You might be more of a realist, as well as your rose tinted spectacles obviously work one way, mine work another way.
Yeah. I'm seeing, it's really frustrating now because we're sort of 1 minute from the end of our time, and I can actually see a sort of a beautiful dialogue sort of starting here where, I mean, I always believe that there's always going to be right on both sides and more to find out from both, perspectives if we can delve a bit deeper. So we might have to continue this conversation another time. So, Barbara, is there any winding up comment there that you?
Yeah, look, there's just some great questions, but I think we've sort of just run out of time. But thank you very much for everybody for putting their questions in and the comments, and we'll keep a record of these as well. But yeah, thank you very much to everybody. And I'm sorry we just didn't get to all of them, but great questions. So thank you.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just go to each of Kerry and Cheryl to see if you've got any final remarks that you'd like to make before I wind up.
Well, only that I congratulate you on what you're doing, and I encourage you to keep on going. And as I've said to you privately before, I'm happy to see what help I can be to influence any change in the federal parliament. But just to finish off by saying, I don't think we should all be despairing. I think we should actually be feeling positive that we can and will do this.
Thank you. Thank you, Cheryl.
And I'd just say we can't choose what's happening to us, but we can choose our response. That's what we can control. So I think that gives me the enthusiasm and the buoyancy that Kerry had in her earlier comment. We choose this. No one chooses our response. We choose it.
Thank you, and thank you very much to Kerry and Cheryl. I'll give you a bit of a Zoom clap, and thank you. I'm just going to very quickly put on my share screen just to tell you what our next upcoming events are. Sorry, the slideshow. Where's my slideshow down? There we go. So our big event that we've got coming up in September is the last event of our National Congress of Women series. We've already had 2 one-day online events. The first one was particularly talking about women and women rising. The second one was talking about collaboration and bringing people together. And in this third event, which is going to be in person and it's going to be in Canberra, so we're quite excited about that. We're going to be talking about, well, we call it renewal. What are the actions? What can we pull out of all that we've learned over the last couple of years, all these conversations, into a sort of an action? Well, we are preparing something which we call a women's charter, and we want to convert that into some real actions going forward to make the change and work in this new government environment to make sure that the working together really does happen and we can really get that balancing of the climate that we want to happen. So yes, so put that in your diaries, go to the website, and I hope we might see you there. And also, now some of you who came to our 28th of April event might remember that in the afternoon we had a wonderful workshop that was run by Wicked Elephants facilitators, Deb Collins and Caress. I've forgotten her name, and Caress. And they'd prepared this eco-feminist action cycle, and it was really about how to for yourself think about where you were in relation to your own actions, and empower you to take action. And they are actually going to run another workshop, especially for WCC, focusing on your actions within the WCC. People that maybe have joined our organisation come to some of these events and thinking, well, what can I really do? This workshop will really focus on where you are in that cycle and what you might be feeling called to do in relation to our initiatives, or create your own initiatives within this organisation that we've set up. So I hope that we might see some of you at that as well. And you probably can't read the registration site there, but if you go to our website, womensclimatecongress.com, and go to the events page, the registration details are there. So thank you very much, everybody. I'm just going to put you back on gallery view so that we can all say goodbye and have a wave. It's been great to spend this hour with you. I should just mention that because of the September event, we're not going to have these webinars in July and August. We've just got such a lot to do to pull off that 2-day event in Canberra. We are having that workshop that I just mentioned, but we won't be having these online conversations now until October. But we hope to see you in September at our event in Canberra. So goodbye, everyone. Have a good evening. And thank you very much to Kerry and Cheryl, and to Barbara very much for that.